For today's Saturday Extra, we'll be looking at an interesting ship. Not necessarily for anything done in active service in this case. No, the story of USS Thompson is more interesting for what happened after she left service. Prior to that point, the ship had just been one of many Clemson-class destroyers. A quiet peacetime life before being decommissioned due to treaty restrictions. After her removal from service, however, this ship had a second life as a floating restaurant in San Francisco Bay, before then being used as a target ship and left in place, where the rusting hulk remains to this day, making her, alongside her sister USS Corey, one of only two Clemsons remaining above water, at least partially. That said, none of this would have been apparent when the ship was laid down. That came on September 25th, 1918, in the Bethlehem Yard in San Francisco. Thompson began her life as one of many four-stacker destroyers. The Navy was pumping these out at an absurd pace to build up for the Great War and the immediate aftermath. Evidence of this pace can be seen in how quickly Thompson was built. The destroyer was launched on January 15th, 1919. By no means the fastest Clemson, but still only a few months after her keel was laid. Interestingly, you can also see evidence of the slowdown in construction with the Great War concluded. Thompson took longer to fit out, with the ship only commissioned on August 16th of 1920. For a destroyer, especially a four-stacker, that was quite the drawn-out fitting out. It would also mean, as things turned out, that she only had a decade of active service. But we'll get to that after a short detour to design. USS Thompson, as a standard Clemson, displaced around 1,200 tons. This was on the larger end for a Great War design, allowing for a decent weapon load. This began with 4 4-inch guns for the main battery, with one carried on the bow and one on a stern deckhouse. The other two, meanwhile, were mounted on a gunhouse between the stacks, one on either side of the ship. Those guns were backed up by a single 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. This was the designated loadout, although various ships would carry various machine guns. Those guns were, however, not the main weaponry. That came in the torpedoes, which were quite numerous, especially for the time. 12 21-inch tubes carried in 4 triple mounts. These were staggered along the amidships section of the ship, with 2 mounts to a side. The last of the weaponry for its part consisted of depth charges on the stern. And to round things off past that point, we come to speed, which came out to 35 knots on around 26 to 27,000 shaft horsepower, depending on the source. Now with the design done, we can go back to Thompson's service, which, at least in active duty, was about as quiet as you can expect. It began on September 4th, 1920, with the new destroyer's shakedown cruise. This was a fairly uneventful affair, seeing Thompson sail along the west coast for about a month. Nothing much happened before she docked at San Diego on September 29th. With her shakedown complete, the new destroyer took up duty with the battle fleet, specifically as part of Destroyer Division 32, and to further subdivide things, Destroyer Squadron 11. Her service in this role would follow the usual pattern for the 1920s. Thompson stuck around the West Coast for the most part on various fleet maneuvers and training exercises, with the exception of the odd voyage to foreign ports. The first of these came early on January 7th, 1921. This saw Thompson sail south for fleet training off Panama, before then continuing on to train off the Chilean coast. Another similar voyage occurred on February 4th, more training off Panama and a stopover in El Salvador when that was complete. Thompson's next voyage after this saw her train to the north, this time sailing up to Seattle. Nothing particularly eventful, but a change of pace for the crew, and a prelude to her first major refit for that matter. That came on December 10th, 1921, when the ship sailed for Bremerton. Although, while I say major, that's only in comparison to routine overhauls. Thompson's refit was finished by February of 1922, at which point she returned to San Diego and the battle fleet. For the next few years, 1922 to 1925, she mostly hung around either California or Panama, with the odd trip into the Caribbean for exercises on the other side of the continent. However, the most exciting part of her active service definitely came in 1925, when USS Thompson moved out into the wider Pacific on April 25th. This first saw a stopover in Hawaii for more training. This would conclude by July 1st, 1925, at which point the fleet set out on a goodwill tour. This took Thompson all the way across the Pacific for stopovers in Australia and New Zealand, as well as Samoa. Other than a hearty welcome in Melbourne and other ports, there wasn't much excitement in this voyage. It was a long-distance trek, especially for a Clemson, but it was also a fairly typical port visit, for better or worse. It also concluded by the end of August 1925, a short voyage in the grand scheme of things, with Thompson back in San Diego by September 26th. At this point, her career returned to the usual work. The destroyer would remain around the West Coast for the rest of her career, aside from a visit to the East Coast in 1926. All well and good, and pretty typical for the class and time period, until it came to an abrupt end on April 4th of 1930. As part of the London Treaty limitations on tonnage, Thompson was decommissioned. The ship was also probably a bit worn down by a decade of constant service. Quiet or not, the ship was certainly pretty active, and the Navy liked the system of working Clemson's or Wicks-class ships dry, then replacing them with ships from the reserve. Either way, Thompson was decommissioned, and then sold for scrap on June 10th, 1931. However, that scrapping was only partial. The weaponry and other such things were removed, but the hull was left in more or less one piece, and Thompson somehow ended up in private hands, where the stripped hulk was moored in San Francisco Bay as a floating restaurant during the Great Depression, and at least until it ended in 1933, a floating bar during Prohibition. Makes one wonder what kind of stories came out of this period, especially with how sparse details are. In any event, Thompson remained in this role for some time. How long isn't exactly clear. What is clear is that by 1944, the Navy decided they wanted the ship back. In February 1944, they bought back Thompson's hulk and sank her in mudflats, where the ship was used as a target for bombing runs using dummy bombs. After the Pacific War ended, Thompson was left in place and more or less forgotten about. The wreck is still there to this day, although very little remains. Her hulk was a popular visiting spot for the more adventurous types. I wouldn't really advise it now, but people apparently still visit from time to time. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.